power. That's why we use this tool. I believe it has this power to connect us to ourselves, to each other, and to nature, while simultaneously centering the remaking of our social relations. We are embarking on the radicalization of food and body. In the feminist table, I see some of my sisters that are here. We are doing this in the Rural Women's Assembly. We are doing this in the Rita Edwards Collective. And for all of those of you who are not in the know, we are doing this. Join us, participate with us, take it into your own movements, enliven and expand. Because what we need is a new language and a new politics that enables living with, not against, nature and women. Thank you.
Donna, thanks so much for that powerful account of getting us to think of new things to take home. Stephen, if you would like to conclude for us, thank you.
Thanks for this opportunity. I've got a mishmash of things that I want to say here, and they're really just some reflections on the topic that we've got in front of us. On the one side, I want to talk a little bit about contemporary capitalism and technology and some of the issues that are facing us. And I also couldn't resist just making a few comments on the current situation in South Africa, because I think that we're in an urgent situation, and I think we need to try and find ways to bind the issues that Pat has been bringing up here with some of the struggles that we need to wage in this country. So I just want to start with the big picture on the tendencies in contemporary capitalism, things like technology, financialization, inequality, and concentrated power. Now, obviously, Pat has talked about these quite a bit. I just want to cast a few more issues, or put a few more issues onto the agenda, including BNR, which is biotechnology, nanotechnology, and robotics, and artificial intelligence. These are things which we, in the food sector, don't really, apart from biotechnology, we're not really considering the potential implications of some of these technological developments and the urgency for a response before the things get too late. For example, in South Africa, when we talk about biotechnology, it's embedded in our food system now. It's very difficult now to start challenging biotechnology in South Africa. Of course, it can be done, but it becomes more difficult once it's already there. So do we want to wait until nanotechnology is a reality of a certain sort, and I'll talk about that just now, or robotics or artificial intelligence in the way that they're going to be formulated under capitalism, or do we want to be responding now and thinking about how to deal with these issues? Okay, so I'm not going to talk in detail about those three things. I think it's too much detail at this stage. I want to talk just quickly about financialization, because it hasn't been touched at all. The first thing to say is that in these companies that are merging at the moment, behind the scenes, you've got some very significant financial ownership in all of these companies. BlackRock, Vanguard, Capital Research. Nobody's heard of these organizations, but actually they form a web. They've got ownership in every single one of these companies. They're the shareholders that we hear about that are driving these processes of mergers. Okay, BlackRock currently manages 7% of the total wealth in the world today. One institution. We need to look at these institutions, understand the power of finance capital in the current era, behind the mergers. So there may be some context-specific logics within agricultural inputs that Pat was talking about, but there's broader logics even outside of that influence the broader food system, that influence other economic systems, energy, mining, all of it interconnected. Okay. I just wanted to talk about derivatives quickly, because this is a way in which so-called wealth is being created, which is detached from productive activity. So just some stats. The value of global productive economy is around $108 trillion. Debt is around $200 trillion at this stage. So the global debt is greater than the total amount of global GDP. Okay. Then derivatives are between $630 trillion and $1.2 quadrillion at this stage. That's the nominal value. Okay, that's 6 to 12 times the total value of all productive activity in the globe. But the thing is, the system is structured in such a way that those people who are producing this so-called wealth actually make a claim on the formal economy. They make a claim on the productive economy. They extract the value from the productive economy to pay themselves. And it's driving concentration in the global system. Okay, I wanted to talk about speculation, but I'll leave that out for now. I think there's a couple of key issues that really confront us now quite urgently in terms of the technologies. We have to think about the relationship between technology and power and our relationship to how we see technology. Science is a model of social organization. It's not the be-all and end-all. As a method, it has been phenomenally effective in transforming the world. I mean, if we look at since Industrial Revolution and all of those exponential curves that you see from that time, it really has transformed the world beyond what we can imagine. Now, it's embedded in unequal social relations, and I think this is the key point I want to make about the technologies. So it's not really a question about being Luddites, okay? It's not a question about being anti-technology, but the key question is about ownership and control over technologies. Okay, I'll come back to that just now. There's a direct link in the current era of capitalism to intellectual property, which is the commodification and privatization of social knowledge. So if we think of all the knowledge that exists in the world as being a product of all people, it's like a pool of knowledge. That knowledge has been privatized. That knowledge has been captured by certain interests for their own gain and their own benefit. It's a key locus of value capture in a knowledge economy, which is where we are now. And it's well underway in agriculture as well, if you look at intellectual property on seed, if you look at private ownership of all the inputs. Okay. The structure of ownership necessarily shapes the character of technology and the direction of its development. It channels technological research and development towards activities that favor the profitability of the owners of that technology or of those processes of technological development. So you get technological pathways which produce institutions that are too big to fail. So we saw that in the financial crisis, where the states basically looked and said, if we allow these financial institutions to collapse, the whole economy is going. We have to bail them out. We have to. So they took money, public money from the future, and basically gave it to the banks to keep surviving. Now we're having a situation in agriculture where we're having exactly the same situation. It'll be very easy for Bayer Monsanto to make an argument, we're too big to fail. Should they make a mess, somebody's going to have to bail them out. There's no way that the governments are going to allow them to collapse. I mean, they're producing the seed of the system. Okay. So we're heading in that direction very quickly. They haven't used the argument yet, but it's in the back pocket. They've got a precedent already. Now, the ideological justification, Pat did touch on this a little bit. To me, there's two things. The one side is a techno-utopia, where technologies will liberate humans from the drudgery of labor and we'll all live lives of leisure, including backbreaking agricultural work. And you have the thing where it is presented as the best for women, because women are the ones who have to bend down in the sun the whole day, hoeing, next day the same thing, next day the same thing. If you can have technologies that liberate women from that, what are you complaining about? Okay, that's the one argument that we have to take up and we have to deal with. Of course, it's a very one-dimensional view of what agriculture is, because it's not only about that labor, it's much more than that. And we know it's much more than that. All the things Donna was talking about, the values, the food and the meaning of food in society. Okay, a second core ideological pillar is the one that Pat was mentioning about, that only large-scale, complex and centralized systems can ensure that we have enough food for everybody. Okay, and that can forecast future demand. There's a lot of risks. We need to understand what those risks are. You need big data to be able to interpret what the risks will be ahead of time so you can act on it. Who's going to be able to do that individually? No one. It has to be big corporations. It has to be big entities that can manage all of that data. So that's a kind of a logic. So I want to just deal with these. Now, in the 1970s, how will we feed the 500 million? Today we have precisely the same argument, except it's how will we feed the 9 billion? How will we feed people in cities? People in cities don't produce their own food. what is going to happen? You need these entities, complex systems of supply chains to bring the food into supermarkets to distribute to people. So I want to talk about these ones quickly. First, the one on the drudgery of labor. But I think we need to look at the reality of this. Machines and computers are currently replacing workers in manufacturing and industry at a rapid rate. Okay? This could theoretically create shorter working days and more leisure for people. You could have shorter working hours but be paid the same. There's many different possibilities. But in reality, it's been used to force workers out, to reduce wages, to increase precarity of workers. And on the other hand, you have immense concentration of profit and wealth in the hands of some corporations that control these same technologies. Okay, so there's an uneven distribution of benefits from the technologies, primarily because of the ownership and control structure. Okay, there are similar processes in agriculture. Mechanization and economies of scale are the model for agriculture. It's definitely in South Africa, it's definitely in Africa. That's the model that's been pushed. You must have economies of scale. It's the only way to do it. In the capitalist core, you have drones and robots doing work that people were doing in the fields. And the result is that small farmers and peasants are being dispossessed globally. I watched a movie just recently about France and how the peasantry in France is basically losing its livelihood as well. It's the same things that are happening here. It's not like it's somehow totally different. They're forced to grow bigger. If they can't grow bigger, if they can't fill in all the bureaucratic forms for the European Union, for their subsidies, this, that, they'll close down. They're forced to get bigger in order just to survive. Milk producers 100 times bigger than they were before, but they're saying they're basically making exactly the same money they were making before. Okay, but somebody else is benefiting. Parmalat, all the big milk companies are getting bigger and bigger. Okay, so farmers end up being workers on large-scale commercial farms, or they're just abandoned to their own fate. In Africa, definitely, we can't think that we're going to follow a kind of a linear modernization model of Europe or the United States. There's no situation now where we're now going to develop industry, workers will go to industry, they will do better there, the urban. It's not going to happen like that. Combined and uneven development means that stage is almost missed out. You jump straight from being on the land to being dispossessed without the skills or without the space to operate in the economy, in a kind of a knowledge, postmodern type of economy. Okay. What this does also is that it breaks a fundamental organic link between humans and the earth, and I think this is something that we can have more discussion about, but it's very crucial, because once that link is broken, it becomes much more difficult to put that back together again. For example, in South Africa, we have a situation where the majority of small-scale farmers, black small-scale farmers, have either been marginalized or have totally lost access to the land. Now, are we in a situation, in the current capitalist context, are we in a situation where it's feasible for those farmers to survive in the current climate? We have to change the whole climate as well. We have to change the whole economic structure in order for a small farming system to work in this country. Something I'll come back to just now again as well. I think biotechnology and nanotechnology, if we look into the future, we can see that the logic of this is the obsolescence of land-based production systems, okay? Things will move into the lab. You'll have laboratory-produced meat, laboratory-produced grains, a small group of experts. There'll be no connection to the land and food and humans anymore, okay? Of course, we can have an argument about whether that's good or bad, but to me, that doesn't sound like a very good system, because what happens to those humans? 2 minutes, yo. Okay. Okay. Synthetic biology, again, I think this is an existential threat, I think. We're facing a situation where the reproductive capabilities of women will be taken away, or the effort is to take those away, to separate women from the reproductive capabilities. Now, in a context of patriarchy, of violence and genocide, I think that we then head in that logic towards slavery, towards genocide, literally, of women. I think it's a very clear logic. Now, if we look at the global situation, Trump, fascism, the rise of authoritarianism. We're moving towards those kinds of things already. It's not like something that we're just now making up out of our minds. Oh, there's a big bogey. It's there. We are in this time now, and we have to respond to this time. Okay, I'm going to jump very quickly to comments on South Africa, just a couple of comments. I mean, there's a lot to say about the current situation in South Africa now. This isn't the right time, unfortunately, or the right place. But I think that we are entering a period of organic crisis in South Africa. This is basically a period where the hegemony, the ruling hegemony, is rapidly breaking down. Okay, the ANC has held it together since the early 1990s, or maybe the late 1980s. But I think we're now entering a comparable period at the end of the ANC's rule. I think we are now entering into a situation where the question of what comes after the ANC, what does the society look like after the ANC, is now posed as a necessity. We have to ask that question because that hegemony is crumbling. Okay, so there's different ways in which there'll be many responses to this. We definitely know there'll be a response of authoritarian and violence. There'll be a top-down imposition. But at the same time, it opens a space for kind of a refreshing of a left agenda. What is it that we want to see? Let's go back to the UDF days and think about that. What did we do? What worked there? What didn't work? What would we do better this time round? Now's our opportunity. Okay, so we must learn those lessons. I think this is where Pat's input comes in very importantly because the global context is also quite different. We are in a context where South Africa is absolutely integrated and dependent on the global system. Okay, finance capital flows through South Africa as one of its nodes. The technologies are embedded in South Africa. Okay, so we can't really try and solve the issues in South Africa without having a broader view. Now, it's probably quite lame, it sounds quite lame to talk about Lenin 100 years ago talking about you can't have socialism in one country. Or was it Trotsky? I can't remember. You can't have socialism in one country. I think we also have to look at the South African situation. Our solutions here cannot happen only in South Africa. We can find some partial solutions and we can cover up certain things, but the solution has to be global. I think we're in a context also where global hegemony is under, it's shaking. I think we're in a global organic crisis, actually. If you look at Trump, if you look at the way that people are responding to the ruling elites, I think it's very clear that there are dynamics which we should be definitely trying to build on to connect with global struggles. Okay, so when we're thinking about our South African struggles, let's also think about those. The last thing I want to say is quickly about these new technologies and agricultural inputs. Because we now have a situation where we've got certain political elites talking about radical economic transformation, but those very same elites are permitting these kinds of corporate concentration to go on. What is the implications of this for any kind of agrarian transformation which is more equitable, which distributes land in a meaningful way, 90% of the land to match the distribution of the population at the minimum, where you want to move to agroecology, you want to move to diversity of production sizes, so it's not all about huge farms and then a few small subsistence people trying to eke a living on the side. Where's that middle? Where are all those smaller farms? Where's that diversity of production systems? Definitely this acceptance of these kinds of mergers is operating entirely against that. So we can't talk about radical economic transformation on the one hand and also allow multinationals to occupy the space in this way on the other hand. So I used some shorthand in terminology there, but I think we can have some discussions about some of those. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen, and sorry for the tight timekeeping. I just think it's important that the conversation is extended and, yeah, more of a collaborative conversation. So we'll have an open time for questions now. I think we'll take 3 questions at a time. If you just want to introduce yourself and either direct the question to the person or, yeah, if it's not a question and just a contribution, then, and I'll try and keep it short so everyone can have a chance to contribute. If the speakers would maybe like to come and sit in the front, just so it's easier that they're directed. Sorry.
We were talking about technology in farming. Like overall, it felt like there was a bit of a negative viewpoint to technology in farming, and we understand what big data and all of these other aspects are. But I just wanted to pose a question to Stephen. If he feels that there are any appropriate technologies that would allow the development of small-scale farmers as specifically an agroecological value chain.
Thanks. Any other questions to Stephen or anyone else on the... Yeah.
My name is Ben from Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and my question would go to Pat. It was mentioned that financialization is an important element.
Sorry?
Financialization and the role of very few specific actors. And I know that in other subsectors, like for example the beverage industry, you also have the very same few funds who are not just financing the mergers, but they are driving it actually against the big ones, like against Coca-Cola. Or when SAB Miller was taken over, also it was by NBEF, it was the finance funds actually taking over. So I'd like to understand the role of the finance sector in this push now, because you gave an explanation in technical terms that it's technology driven, but I'm pretty sure that BlackRock is not just saying, oh, here you have some money, you have some credits to take over. What is their interest and what can be done against this, or how can it be framed that they appear also?
Thanks, Ben. Third question for Shanti.
I'm Doreen Miller from the Wits School of Governance. Thank you to the panelists for passionate inputs. Donna, I'm not sure if I'm missing your conclusions and your implications. What do you want to see done differently in the new food politics? You suggesting that limitations that exist, and I think that critique extends to the food sovereignty movement as well. What do we need to do differently?
Thank you. I think, we'll start with Matt's question to Stephen.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I did mention that we can't be Luddite about this, that we can't be anti-technology. I just think that it's a question of control over technologies, but that also once you assert democratic control over technology, they're going to look different to what we have now. I do think that for me, a very clear and straightforward practical thing that we can do now is start working towards looking at innovation from the ground, looking at technologies that are appropriate to people. Of course, technologies have been developed and those technologies can be adopted, but it must be driven from the priorities of people on the ground in localities, which means they're going to be very diverse in different places. So I think that seed is a good example where you have seed improvement, but what happens is that the way that improved seed now, when you talk about it in a formal system, is captured by intellectual property. It's locked into a particular model of doing it, and farmers are left out of that model and become passive, like recipients of the technology afterwards. Whereas a definite alternative, which is being in practice and which ACB we are looking at as well, is about how farmers themselves can do improvements based on their local conditions and the local ecologies, which are they're irreducibly diverse. You have to start from that locality and move on. So, I mean, I think that's simple.
Perhaps had a contribution to your question.
Yeah, we spend all of our time in the Center Group dealing with technologies, and we come up with, I think, maybe two principles that we like to think of for ourselves as being laws of technology, and which may help or not, I'm not sure. And we debate them all the time, but one of them is that any new technology that's introduced into a society which is not itself a just society, and I haven't seen one lately, then that technology in that unjust society will exacerbate the gap between the rich and the marginalized. And not just exacerbate in the sense of the rich getting richer, it means the poor actively, the marginalized actively get more marginalized. I think history shows that. So our concern is who controls the technology is a very large concern. It's not that some technologies aren't innately bad, some of them are, and some are definitely better, but in the wrong hands, it always works against marginalized peoples. The second rule for us as we've looked at different technologies over time is that the reality is that technologies don't actually have to be scientifically or technically successful in order to be profitable. And we see endlessly the introduction of really bad, stupid technologies that still gain support and make companies very rich. Biotechnology, generation 1 is a good example of that, but there are many others. So that's the context in which we look at any introduction of any new technology. But there are, I mean, we do want farm machinery that works better at the local level, addressing the needs of the people in the field, in smallholder production. We need more of that. We need lots more information about how our systems work than we have now, so we want those technologies. At the same time, while I say that, I have absolutely no hesitation at all of being called a Luddite. Luddites were trying to protect their livelihoods, their families, and their communities against a rather stupid strategy towards large-scale textile production. And the Luddites were right. And I would be happy to be a Luddite anytime that happens, when our families and our communities are in danger of being destroyed for a bunch of textiles.
Pat, could you
I'll leave
conclude?
that. That's it.
Donna wants the last contribution, and then we need to move on to Ben's question.
No, I'm wanting to respond, but Pat's answered a lot of, I mean, I'm on the same page as him. So I think the important thing to add is that the idea, certainly that modernity constantly wants to suggest, is that there's a technological fix. And I think that anything that we do in relation to technology must understand and recognize that it's not going to be a technological fix, because we can have a conversation with thinking of food as a pill, or thinking about climate change in terms of adaptation and mitigation, etc. So it's the politics of the question that we want to ask about technology, who it serves, where it serves, and who controls it. And I think that that's central. And linked to what I was trying to say earlier about the technology question, or that I didn't say rather, but it is about the social relations. And so in that way, if I'm going to be presented with a conversation which is false, actually, which is, oh, you don't want a microwave, and that's going to be bad for you as a woman because it means that you stand in front of a pot cooking longer, then that's a false way to have that conversation. And I think that's what we have to engage. And if you want to read some really interesting feminist stuff, then Ursula Yu's writes about technology in the lives of women that I think is useful.
Thanks, Donna. And Pat's, Ben's question.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Financialization.
Well, it's a very important point. And I honestly, Ben, I don't think we have a clear grasp of the answer, but because there's different levels of financialization. There's the kind of stuff that's sort of the giant asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard and so on, Capital. There's half a dozen that really stand out in the agricultural field, who are clearly investing. BlackRock is involved in each one of the big 6 companies in seeds and pesticides. I'm adding BASF here. It's not Syngenta, not ChemChina, but the others. And so it knows what's happening in those companies. It has access to, is privy to information that no one else is privy to. And its capacity then to use that and to manipulate the marketplace for their interests in the long-term directions of the companies is quite scary. Vanguard's pretty much in the same situation. So I think we where they want to take this, I'm not sure, but I can absolutely sure that they're not just looking at the input side of the market. They're also heavily invested in downstream, in the processing industries in agriculture. And you mentioned the food and the beverage companies, and they're also involved in the retail end. They're messing up with those companies as well. So we need to be watching them much more closely than we have, and we haven't been. At least I haven't been, that's for sure. The second area of investment, though, we have to look at is back to the beverage companies. We have this one company, 3G Capital, theoretically run out of Brazil, in reality run out of New York City, which has spent $250 billion on food and agricultural deals in the last few years. $250 billion. They're the ones behind the merger of the big brewery companies. So we now have one brewery company that controls 50% of the profits and 25% of the sales of all the beer we drink in the world. But we're also behind all the other mergers, and also just tried to buy Unilever a few weeks ago, and is still in the market to buy other companies. I mean, these are and move into the meat production field as well. They're heavily behind all the GBS and all the other major meat processing companies. So you have that kind of active investment, which is much more, very, very active, very directive, compared to the BlackRocks of the world. And we need to be breaking those guys up as well. That just shouldn't be possible. And what we see is a highly destructive approach. I mean, the approach of 3G Capital is to go into a company, tear it down to the bare bones, get rid of any kind of research capacity in the company, which is often actually good to get rid of, but not always, and gets rid of all the employees they possibly can. And then finally, with a bare bones company left over, they probably sell it off and move on to the next company, meanwhile profiting very well.
Do you want to respond to Darlene's question?
Sure, and everybody else, okay? But on the financialization and connecting this to food and part of the conversation that we're having, one of the first introductions I had to a mapping of the region was Darlene Miller's work on globalization and ShopRite. And so that's part of this conversation, I think, about connecting and thinking about food, concentration and extension into the region specifically. And if you talk about technology, being traumatized recently, and I walked into Observatory Pick and Pay in Cape Town, and they had these auto scans, and I had for many years organized packers and ShopRite workers. So for me it was quite a big confrontation. And so in relation to this question about both what you say, what is the political crisis at the moment, which is, I think, in response to your what is to be done or how do we want to think about it, it's one to recognize that as much as certainly as a political economist, that's the first conversation I want to have. But I think we have to have it as a multidimensional crisis, and we have to think of it like that. Because if we only think about it in terms of financialization, or we only think about it in terms of what does it mean for labor, etc., I think we're going to dislocate ourselves. And that's the point that I was trying to make in terms of enlivening and connecting our conversation about what's in the plate and what controls our body. And the point that Stephen was making about the state, the point is the authoritarianism of the state and corporate capital to control what goes in my body and what's on my plate. So it's to make that connection alive, and I guess that's part of what I'm trying to articulate. And I think the second thing is, Darlene, when you wrote that study, when you did that study, it was fantastic. I think it was my introduction to ShopRite and seeing ShopRite very differently. And I raised this because 15 years ago, 20, I don't know how long ago. Okay, we won't give anything away. A long time ago, when that study was done, I remember defending and responding in relation to the question of wages and work, and saying, and very much took on a productivist, at the time I hadn't thought of it like that, but an articulation about wages and workers at the site of production, right? Now, many years later, I'm confronted when you ask the question about what do we do in terms of workers and labor and farm workers, and that's why I started off with this conversation, which I'd like John to continue with, which when he spoke